Good evening, everyone. I'm Vicki Petersen, EMS for Children Program Director for the state of Iowa. Welcome to the Heartland EMS for Children's Coalition Symposium on MCI response. This is the 14th topic in our ongoing free pediatric education series. It's also our 7th symposium using Children's Minnesota's education and training system for continuing ed credit. Children's does require that you create an account on their learning site to receive your education credit. This will have several benefits for you. It will provide your certificates a lot faster than in the past. And when you create that account, it gives you access to all the other continuing education that's available on that site. So take a look at their catalog. There might be something else that you're interested in. Children's Minnesota also issues EMS credit. So EMS providers can get CEUs the same way that the rest of our registrants do. That means a faster response time for you as well. EMS providers can watch together as a group. 2, using one registration link, just make sure to email your roster or your list of attendees to your state EMSC manager by the end of the day Thursday, so we can provide your credit. By the way, there's no need to put your name in the chat like webinars sometimes ask you to do. Zoom will give us a record of all the attendees who registered and your viewing time. We won't take a scheduled break tonight, but if you need one, please step out at any time. Before we move into our presentation tonight, I do want to tell you a little bit about the folks who bring you these symposiums. These symposiums are a product of your state EMSC program. EMSC stands for Emergency Medical Services for Children, and it's the only federally funded program in the country that's dedicated to helping emergency care providers like you give the very best care to kids. Each state and territory has an EMSC program of some kind that is funded in all or in part by a grant from the federal government. Our group is called the Heartland EMS for Children Coalition. We're a group of Midwestern EMS for Children managers from Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And we have banded together to maximize our impact in our own states by pooling our resources and working together. The behind-the-scenes members of this team who are working so hard for you are Corolla Lauck from South Dakota, Kjelsey Polzin from Minnesota, Jessica Baker from Kansas, and Chettie Greer from North Dakota. We also want to give a special welcome to Reagan Blackwell, who is our newest member and the new Nebraska representative. These pediatric symposiums were born during the pandemic from a lot of discussions about how to bring you affordable continuing education. Since September of 2020, we've given 48 hours of free continuing ed for EMS providers, physicians, nurses, APPs, and more on all kinds of topics, including children with special healthcare needs, burns, human trafficking, provider resilience, youth suicide, poisons, and lots more, just to name a few. I also want to let you know that you're in listen-only mode. Your mics and your webcams are disabled. If you have technical difficulty and you need support or you have a comment, please use the chat box and we will respond as we're able to. If you have questions you'd like to be asked to the speakers during our Q&A session at the end, please put those in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we have time for. Finally, all attendees must be present for at least 100 minutes and complete an evaluation to get continuing education credit tonight. Once the symposium is done, you can access your Children's Minnesota account site, fill out the evaluation, and get your credit quickly. If you're group watchers, that credit will come from your state managers. If you don't sign on to Children's Minnesota right away, you'll get an email about completing your evaluation. Your certificates can be found in your account after the evaluations are received. Please print them or save them for your records. Please remember, you do need to complete the evaluation within 30 days of today to receive your credit. After that, you will no longer have the option for credit. As always, reach out to your state program manager if you have any concerns or questions. We're going to show a slide. This is a slide with our contact information. We'll also show this at the end of the presentation, but if you need to take a screenshot so you can contact us, please do. This is accreditation information from Children's Minnesota. Children's disclaimers. And we have no disclosures. Okay, Housekeeping is done. Now on to our presentation. Trauma response happens every day, and mass casualty incidents are increasing. An MCI involving children is particularly difficult for most of us. Our presenters have firsthand knowledge of the response at the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl celebration. They're here to share with us how they responded and what they learned from that event. Our first speaker is Troy Armstrong. Troy has over 20 years experience in public safety, including currently serving as the Director of EMS for Anderson County, Kansas. Troy has a master's degree in management and leadership and a bachelor's degree in emergency services management. He also serves as a member of the Kansas Major Emergency Response Group and the Missouri Disaster Medical Assistance Team. Our second speaker is Morgin Dunleavy. Sorry, Morgin. Morgin is an RN and is Director of Emergency Management and Business Continuity at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. She has a master's in nursing, leadership in nursing and healthcare systems, and a graduate certificate in disaster and emergency management. Now I will turn things over to Troy and Morgin. Welcome to you both.
Vicki, thanks for allowing us to be here this evening and present this. And I think, as you mentioned, MCIs, especially involving children, can really take a toll on us as both medical providers and just as humans in general. So I'm going to start with my presentation this morning, and then I'll turn that over to Morgin, and then, as Vicki said, we'll take questions at the end and address anything that you can think of that you might want to know a little bit more about that we might not have touched base on. First of all, I just want to share that I have no conflict of interest or anything to disclose. As Vicki said, I have approximately 20 years of public safety experience, a couple degrees specific to emergency services management, emergency medical services. Currently paramedic, have my fellow status through the American College of Paramedic Executives, and then Director of Region 5, or excuse me, Director of EMS for Anderson County, Vice President of Region 5 of EMS, member of our Kansas Merge team, and Missouri DMAT DMOR. So as many of you probably remember, back on the 14th of February of this year, we were all gathered in the Kansas City metro area to celebrate the celebration of the Super Bowl, and the Chiefs coming back to celebrate that with us. So the primary objective for that day from emergency medical services on the ground were to mitigate and be able to deliver an all hazards response to anything that might occur. So the parade was set to commence about 11 o'clock, starting roughly in the area of 6th and Grand. It would travel down and extend to Grand and Pershing, and then culminated at the area of Main and Pershing. Then a rally began following that, approximately 12:45, and then it was in the vicinity of Union Station and Liberty Memorial. So a lot of things happened prior to that day. There were a lot of pre-planning meetings, a lot of pre-planning documents that were drafted and started, and Morgin will touch base with her presentation as well. But one of the things that we were a part of was the Kansas City Fire Department's incident action plan that was developed. In that pre-planning, it outlined training, it outlined equipment, utilizing radio operations, utilizing the equipment that Kansas City Fire had on site. It discussed the triage. So if we did happen to have a mass casualty, how we were going to triage during that time. It talked about the partnerships between law enforcement, fire, EMS, the mutual aid partners. It discussed surge capacity in the event that we did have a mass casualty. Communication, not only radio communications, interoperability, but just face-to-face communications as well. And then also it focused on mental health, social services, and the family support of, we did have an incident, how could we reunite all of those families? Lots of resources were assigned to this incident. So there were ambulances, UTVs, pumpers, brush trucks. We had multiple EMS strike teams. Kjelsey Medical was on site. The state of Missouri DMAT had set up 2 tents, and there was regional mutual aid coordinator. So from my office's standpoint, we deployed an ALS side-by-side that was staffed with a paramedic, a RN, and an advanced EMT. And we had transport-capable UTV. So we were assigned to DMAT West, which was a DMAT tent set up on the west side of Union Station. And we were tasked with transporting patients that needed transported to a hospital from that tent. We would take them to a staging location and meet a ambulance that could subsequently transport to the receiving facility. But as you can see, the planning for this went way beyond just the start of the Super Bowl. So this is the second time that we've done this, and we learned from the first time as far as where to set up some of the DMAT tents, how to deploy certain resources. But you can see it's a team effort. So the 3 additional strike teams, each strike team consisted of a minimum of 5 ambulances, and they were kind of stationed and staged outside of the area of downtown Kansas City, so we could respond those in, and the regional mutual aid coordinator from the state of Missouri could work with that strike team leader and deploy them to a certain area that we actually needed them. And that came into play as the day went on. Started out as a pretty typical day, right? So we arrived, started building those pre-event relationships, met with our staging manager, met with the points of contact for Kansas City Fire, went over our communications, made sure that we had good interoperability amongst all of those agencies. As I mentioned, we had DMAT on scene, Kjelsey Medical, various hospital personnel, EMS personnel, law enforcement from local, state, and federal jurisdictions. And so we ensured that we had clear roles and responsibilities. So as mentioned, that's a picture of the AEMT, Sherry Smits, and RN Susie Sykes that was with me on our side-by-side. And we were, again, an ALS transport-capable UTV, and we were assigned to DMAT West. Pretty typical day. We started running some event-related calls of service, anything from intoxicated patrons to people who had fallen, just typical everyday type things. We had one patient that we delivered from DMAT West to an awaiting KCFD med unit. Due to the acuity of that patient, our AEMT was diverted to ride along with the Kansas City Fire Department's med unit and assist with transport to the receiving facility. And that'll come into play kind of as we go back into our story here a little bit more deeper, trying to get that person back to our staging area. Earlier in the day, there was a reported unrelated shooting incident kind of offsite. One of the initial calls and early on in the event was a female in labor at one of the hotels. And so access and trying to get to that person were kind of limited just due to a lot of the road closures, the high amount of pedestrian traffic, and it was just a more of a difficult response than typical. We had 6 patient contacts from our assignment prior to anything occurring with the MCI.
I chose Wix for my business because of its massive scope for functionality and free.
Guys, something's going on. Something's going on, guys. Guys, something's going on. Guys. Guys, something's going on.
So then, as everyone knows, our typical day turned into a not so typical afternoon. As you can see from that video and hear some of the initial reports, there was mass confusion. So at the end of that video, you heard somebody saying something's going on, and then a bystander reports, no, nothing's going on, it's just fireworks. So we had some confusion initially as to what had actually occurred, but it was the unexpected, and we were able to respond to that in an effective and adequate manner because we had that pre-planning in place. So it was about 1:48 in the afternoon. It was about 9 seconds after the last announcement. Multiple gunshots rang out again. Mass confusion. A lot of people didn't realize what was actually occurring. As you can imagine, panic and just a mass evacuation of the area ensued. At that point, once it was determined what was occurring, Kansas City fire leaders immediately enacted the mass casualty response. It was initiated, and we began to work with triage. So there was a lot of confusion as to where the actual shooter was, how many shooters had actually been involved, and what the actual intent of the situation was. But at that point, we were just focused on initiating our MCI protocol and starting triage. So we began field triaging patients using the START technique. We took all of those triage patients back to a casualty collection point, which was in our area, DMAT West. It had already been determined that any triage patients would go back to the DMAT tent for secondary triage treatment and await transport. Once this occurred, we did activate those additional ambulance strike teams, and they were asked to respond into the area along with additional mutual aid partners. One thing that we really need to focus on from an EMS standpoint is when we're looking at a mass casualty is that patient tracking. So how are we able to adequately look at where was our patient transported, and how did they get there, and how can we reunite family members? And I think Morgan can talk to a little more to that, but we did a good job from the field standpoint of ensuring that patient tracking was done. And that can be as simple as just grabbing a piece of paper and writing it down to, a fancy digital system or whatever your jurisdiction might have the access to do. And so I think when we look all back onto that day, it was a senseless act of violence, and we were unable to make sense of it. And that was shared by one of the victims' fathers. One of the primary victims that we responded to was a teenage male with a gunshot wound to the temporal area of the head. He was extremely hemodynamically stable. Initially had been triaged of red. Once he was transported to the DMAT tent, we were able to make contact with him, provide some secondary treatment, applied a C-collar, got an IV saline locked, and we're able to load him into our UTV and meet an awaiting ambulance at a staging location. Sorry about that, guys. He was ultimately transported to an appropriate facility. So what kind of prepared us for all of that? I don't know that you can ever be truly prepared for an incident such as the shooting that day or any sort of mass casualty, whether it be adult or pediatrics. But pediatrics always tend to make things a little bit more higher energy, higher amped situation than maybe just dealing with our typical everyday adult patients. So there's multiple training opportunities and multiple ways of funding those. So the Tactical Emergency Casualty Care class and the TCC, the Tactical Combat Casualty Care class, both through NAEMT are great resources for EMS agencies to look at and utilize. The Rescue Task Force model, if you're not utilizing that, implementing that and working with law enforcement to allow EMS to operate in a warm zone, to get those casualties pulled out to a casualty collection point early on, and early transport is vital, especially when we're looking at, any trauma. So whether it be early bleeding control, early airway control, anything that we can do that is just some of those basic adjuncts very early on will increase the survivability of our patients. In Kansas, we are very lucky to look to our regional trauma councils for funding. We're able to pull funding for PHTLS, TECC, TCC, various types of trauma classes from our regional trauma council. So how can we be successful? Again, I don't know that we can ever truly encompass a plan that is going to address everything that we encountered that day. But we have to first acknowledge that there could be an act of violence, or even if it's not an act of violence, there could be any all hazards incident which could result in a pediatric MCI, whether it be a school bus accident, a structural collapse, gas leaks, anything ranging from our violent or active shooters to terroristic attacks to simple MCIs on the roadways. And I think it's vital for an EMS provider to, again, understand that some of the simplest of things, such as bleeding control, is really early on what we need to start with in incorporating our jumpstart triage protocols. So we're starting that triage and sorting our patients, and then making that identification that, hey, we do have a mass casualty incident, declare that, one, to get additional resources en route to assist you, and two, to let those receiving facilities know. That way we're not simply taking the MCI from the field location to another hospital and just basically relocating the geographical location of it. We want to evenly distribute those patients. So recognizing that children's response to stressful incidents are going to be a little bit different than adults, right? So again, as I mentioned, the shooting incident, I don't know that any of us were truly prepared for that. But can you imagine being an 8, 10, even 16-year-old child or even younger, one, being shot, or two, seeing a family member shot, or seeing other people just having that fear, and then you not knowing yourself as a child. So we want to make sure that we're empowering our EMS providers to effectively support children in that type of manner, and be doing it in a safe way as well. And then one thing that we need to look at, especially with pediatrics, and I'm sure you're all familiar with jump start triage compared to adult start triage, is the airway component when we're looking at pediatric triage. So it's important to note that there are some interventions that we can do that don't take a lot of time, just positioning, manipulation, or that simple 5 rescue breaths with ventilation that are a bit different than when we're triaging adults, that would make the difference in a survivability of a pediatric patient. Again, I talked a little bit about the confusion. Initially, people did not understand what was going on. Some did understand that there was a shooting. Some others thought it was fireworks. Others didn't know what was going on. Even well into the event, we still had quite a few people who were just, I think, still dazed and hanging out and not sure what was going on. But there was a rapid response. And the rapid response not only came in the form of EMS, but it came in the form of law enforcement. So the law enforcement personnel on scene immediately started looking for that threat and how to reduce it. So they immediately started to begin searching the area, not only assisting EMS with activating our mass casualty plan and getting into those areas, but looking for any active threats as well. Stop the dying. I think that goes back to how we have to build a culture of resilience in our communities. We saw a lot of patients who had bystander first aid applied prior to even the arrival of EMS. But I think bleeding control and those basic airway adjuncts are vital to be taught to our communities and to be part of our response plans when we're looking at this. As we mentioned, pediatrics specifically, we have to focus on the airway a bit more than we do with adults. Transport, as I mentioned, we took all of the patients back to DMAT West tent, re-triaged, did some stabilizing treatments, and then moved them to transport to an appropriate facility. So whether the appropriate facility be specific to the injury type or the age of the patient. So if we're looking at a pediatric or a child, taking them to an appropriate facility, or if we're looking at a level 1 or a level 2 trauma that could be going to the local ER in this area. There are several level 1s in the area that we could have transported to, or were these patients, maybe our green tag patients, or even maybe our yellow patients that could be transported to an outlying area that didn't necessarily need that true trauma intervention. And then we needed to look about patient identification. So some of these children, if they were separated from their parents, or they might not have been in the same area that their parents were transported to, maybe they were taken to a different DMAT tent, we needed to identify who they were, how we could get a hold of a guardian, and then ultimately work towards family reunification. And a lot of that was done on the hospital side. I think we've probably all sat through the NIMS and the ICS courses. Probably not the most exhilarating or juvenating type of training that we set through, but they are important. It gives us that systematic approach to handling this and that interoperability, and making sure that regardless of what type of hazard we see, we're having that all hazards, all threats response, and we're able to do it in a well-coordinated manner. So a plan that's applicable for all potential incidents. So we were planning for a parade and a great day, right? But part of the plan called for a response to an MCI such as this. Part of that plan called for severe weather. Part of that plan called for a lot of the incident specifics that we needed to have as a result of this MCI that wasn't necessarily part of the actual event that started the day. We need to improve communication working relationships. So whether it be between public agencies or public and private agencies. So there were a lot of interoperability relationships built off of this event, whether it be between hospitals, EMS, law enforcement, fire, the city officials, the elected officials, street departments, all kinds of different people, and then our private vendors. We had to make sure that any of the private vendors that were there kind of knew a plan and what their roles in the plan were as well. And then just have that common standard that all the reporting agencies know what to do. And we did that because we had that event action plan that was developed by the Kansas City Fire Department. We had a plan in place. We were able to review that plan well prior to the actual day, and we were able to answer any questions that morning during a briefing. So again, we had the preparedness component of that. Communication and information management, it was shared continuously. So prior to, before we even started the day, we had that, the start of the day, and it continued to go throughout the day. We always had real-time information and resource management. So we had a lot of ambulances on scene. We had a lot of resources on scene with fire, transport-capable UTVs, and organizing that, utilizing the NIMS components. We all had a reporting structure of who we knew who to report to, who the command and control was for the different areas, and then making adjustments on the fly. So if we were to a point where we had depleted all of our resources at one ambulance staging location, we were able to replenish those and get additional transport capabilities en route. The preparedness component was necessary for the overall management of this MCI. If it wasn't for that, we would not have had an adequate response. So it was a continuous cycle of planning, organizing, training, the continuous evaluation of the situation was ever evolving. So when we were looking at bed pooling, where were the beds open? How many different hospitals were able to take the different triage colored patients? How was DMAT doing as far as the DMAT tents filling up? And then we had another component of it that some of our staff might have never been trained to deal with this critical of an incident, right? So we have some people who were just not doing well, which is understandably so, being 30 to 40 yards away from the initial shooting incident. And how can we effectively manage and utilize those personnel? So we had a standard overview of the event. The event is the parade and the actual rally itself, but then we had the incident occur, and the incident was the shooting. So we had to make sure that all the agencies involved had the same understanding and knowledge of what was occurring. And as I mentioned, it was very confusing initially. We didn't necessarily know the number of shooters, where they were located, and the overall safety of the area. But we worked with our key stakeholders and our partners from law enforcement to ensure that we were able to continue our operations and get up-to-date information as needed. As I mentioned, resource management brought in those additional strike teams of ambulances. Our regional mutual aid coordinator was able to keep track of what they had available, working with Kansas City Fire to ensure bringing in additional mutual aid partners, evaluating the need for additional ambulances, and then inventorying the resources at the end. So funny story, kind of a funny story at the end of this is we went back to our side-by-side post incident, and we were missing our cardiac monitor, we were missing our backboard and our medication box, and we had our stretcher and our jump bag with us, but those items were been left on the side-by-side, and when upon return were missing. So once we were able to determine those had been procured by another medical team and were actually utilized on another patient, we were able to work with Kansas City Fire, inventory where that resource went, and recover them, not that day, but at a later date. Again, as talked about command and control, we had utilized the incident command system. We all had that span of control reporting to our different leaders. We had a good system in place for sharing public information, and we were able to make sure that overall the multi-agency coordination was effective when looking at resources and interoperability. Again, just want to always maintain and manage any of the plans that we have to kind of be scalable to whatever type of incidents we might identify and occur. So as I mentioned, once the incident occurred of the shooting, we moved into triage mode. So one of the first functions is to begin sorting those patients based on their severity of injuries. We wanted to do the most good for the most amount of patients, and utilizing the least amount of resources, because initially we had no idea of how many patients we had total, and we wanted to be able to continue subsequent operations because we still had other patients in the DMAT tents, right? That not the only thing that was going on was the shooting. We still had other prior patient contacts that we were still caring for. And that was in the treatment sector. The DMAT tents were set up with various different staffing, ranging from technicians to x-ray capabilities to nurses to providers. And so once we were able to take the triaged patients into the treatment sector, still use the same colored zones, still looking at those green, yellow, and red tagged patients. And we started prioritizing the care based on the acuity of the patient, as well as treatment and transport. So the transport sector, again, was kind of embedded with the treatment area. We worked with Kansas City Fire to start funneling ambulances actually a little bit closer to our treatment location, and started transport and just an overall conveyor basically to awaiting ambulances to begin transporting those patients out. So part of the plan was to be able to respond to a multiple patient type of incident, or an MCI. So each ambulance kind of had guidelines of how to respond. The first responding ambulance in this situation wasn't necessarily the commander, because we did have personnel on scene, but if we were responding to this without a pre-plan in place, that might be how you could implement that. And then you also want to start your incident action plan or your MCI plan as soon as you are able to, just so you can get those necessary resources en route. So why do we have an MCI plan, or what's the purpose of having it? It just enables us to effectively respond to those multiple patient encounters. We don't want to tax any single EMS service or a healthcare facility. As I mentioned, we don't want to just move all of the patients from the field location to one hospital, because then all we're doing is just geographically relocating the MCI. We want to make sure that we're assigning specific EMS roles and responsibilities as well as the hospitals. So we want to distribute those patients as evenly as we can into the most appropriate facilities. So we want to make sure acuity-wise and capability-wise we're taking them to the appropriate facility. And then we want to make sure that we have communication between all of our key stakeholders, whether it be fire, EMS, law enforcement, or the hospitals. So if it's just kind of a business as usual type event, we can handle those with our routine resources, right? So command and general staff typically aren't activated during just the typical everyday type thing. We don't necessarily need a written plan, and we can usually handle those calls in about an hour, depending on our geographical locations. But what if we start getting into those MCI events where we look at the small scale incidents, where we require more than just what our routine resources are? So in MCI, in my jurisdiction, is much more of a different view than what an MCI looks like in Kansas City. So in my jurisdiction, we have a total of 4 ambulances, but we only staff 2 to 3 of those on a daily basis. So we're not going to be able to handle those quite as effectively as a jurisdiction that might have more ambulances than we're able to handle. A medium scale that exists when capabilities exceed our typical emergency response. So we might have to start looking at, are we going to implement our command positions, our general positions, and start implementing that ICS structure a bit more than what we normally have. And it might be a multiple operational periods. So this might span more than just that typical everyday incident. It might go into an area where we have to have multiple commanders, multiple operational periods. And we are going to try to have some sort of plan written with that. Then when we get into those large scale incidents, it really expands beyond the capability and control of what we can handle locally. We're going to fill a lot of our command and general staff positions, multiple operational periods, and then we would have a written action plan. When we look at triage, we want to do our primary and our secondary. So the primary is sorting them out based on not necessarily a full set of vital signs, but level of consciousness, RPMs, respirations, perfusion, motor sensory. And then secondary, we're going to start doing a little bit more of that treatment and transport based on more detailed physical exam. So as we've discussed, start and jumpstart triage, we're going to separate the sickest or the most higher acuity patients. Anybody who can walk, we're going to label as green. We will utilize triage tags. Once the color has been designated, we're going to tag that patient, continue, and move on. Again, going back to pediatric, some of our differences with pediatric triage versus adult triage includes that really emphasis on repositioning the airway, delivering those 5 rescue breaths, and maintaining the airway control. How can we help ourselves and our community be more resilient? Offering CPR AED classes, offering stop the bleed classes, until help arrives, and first on the scene. Until help arrives is through FEMA. First on the scene is through NAEMT. Those are 2 great courses you can get certified and teach your community members to help build that resilience. And then, of course, working with our EMS for Children representatives in each state to see what specialized types of equipment are available, what types of training are available, and what resources are available through them to better assist us in a response to a pediatric MCI. We also have to take care of ourselves. So this is a very traumatic incident that occurred. Anytime we have a serious injury or traumatic death of a child or an MCI, or maybe we know the patients, we're in a very rural area here, so we know a lot of our patients, a lot of their families, or even the death of a coworker in the line of duty death. We have to focus on our mental health and make that a priority. So just remember, you're not alone. There are multiple different types of mental health resources out there. So anybody who is needing anything from that aspect, please don't hesitate to reach out. And ultimately, remember that you all make the difference. One of my favorite quotes from Tom Dick is who's a national EMS manager, is that you're going to be there when a lot of people are born. You're going to be there when a lot of people die. And in most every culture, such moments are regarded as sacred and private, made special by a divine presence, and no one on earth would be welcomed, but you are personally invited. What an honor that is. And I think that really encapsulates what we do as EMS providers on a daily basis, as healthcare providers on a daily basis, is that we all have to think back and remember that we are the ones making the difference, whether it be holding a hand, starting an IV, doing a needle decompression. It can be the simplest of things to the most advanced in our training. We have to understand that we're making a difference in those people's lives. Just a few of my references that I used for the presentation, and I'd just like to thank everybody for allowing me to present, and I will turn it over to Morgan.
Thanks, Troy. I appreciate that. Good evening, everybody. I am Morgin Dunleavy. I am the Director of Emergency Management and Business Continuity here at Children's Mercy in Kansas City. Let me get my screen pulled up for you. I'm going to try not to duplicate some of the stuff that Troy said, but there is a little bit of overlap, so I apologize for that. Just a little background on me. I have been a nurse for 20 years. Primarily spent that time in the emergency department, all within pediatrics. I was a nurse here. I've been at Children's for 15 years, was the director of the emergency department for quite a while, and just about 3 years ago moved over to emergency management. So that is my background. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we experienced here at Children's Mercy on the day of the Super Bowl parade, both from a preparedness aspect, but also our response. We did have a team in the field, so I will tell you a little bit about what that looked like for them, as well as what that looked like at the hospital. So as Troy mentioned, this happened on February 14th. We did have the Super Bowl parade and victory rally here in downtown Kansas City. It was a beautiful day outside, and so a lot of people in attendance. It's estimated that we had roughly 1 million here downtown. A little before 2, there was a shooting that took place. It did result in 1 fatality and 22 injuries, 12 of which were children. So looking at tonight, I'm just going to tell you first just a quick overview of Children's Mercy, and then we'll really jump right into the Super Bowl parade. So I will talk to you a little bit about what we've done over the years as Children's Mercy to prepare for an incident like this, and then we'll talk more about our preparedness and response related to the Super Bowl parade. I will share some lessons learned as well, and then we should have plenty of time at the end for questions for both myself and Troy. So who are we? So Children's Mercy is a freestanding hospital with down in Kansas City is where our main hospital is, but we do have 2 campuses, one on the Missouri side and one on the Kansas side. We are a level 1 pediatric trauma center by ACS. We are also part of the Pediatric Pandemic Network. We are a hub site and we lead the disaster domain nationally. That is part of a grant that's funded by HRSA. That was started during COVID, hence the pediatric pandemic name, but really this is a collaborative group that is working to improve healthcare systems and strengthen communities in order to provide high quality, equitable care to children, not only every day, but then during disasters and crises as well. So looking at over the years for Children's Mercy and what we've done around preparedness, full transparency, this is something that we've been working on and really focused on the last 3 years. And so I just want to level set and say that this is not something that we prepared for quickly when we knew the Super Bowl parade was coming our way. We've done a lot of work kind of in the background with all of our teams. So that's what you're seeing here. What that's looked like, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with hazard vulnerability analysis, HVAs. We have done those annually, although Joint Commission just changed requirements, so we've moved those to biannually. We revamped the way that we did that back in 2021 so that we could really take more of an objective look at really what our risks were and how prepared we are for those. And so we had a lot of really vulnerable conversations and hard conversations around, are we truly prepared for the risks that we may happen in our community? One of those was an MCI, and through those conversations, we came to the conclusion that we had quite a few gaps that we wanted to address related to our MCI work. And so we started having planning meetings with stakeholders throughout the hospital. Our emergency department director, medical director of the emergency department, staff within the trauma teams, the ICUs, really all those support teams, to say, what does this look like for us and what do we need to do to get to a place that we would be more capable of responding to an MCI? Part of what came with that was mapping out a 3-year roadmap of how we were going to address some of these gaps. We took our MCI exercises really back to the basics and developed a progressive exercise plan. And so at that point, we were participating in those full-scale community exercises, I think like many of us do. But when we were, looking at it at the end of the day and looking at our AARs, we were finding that we weren't necessarily making improvements the way that we wanted to see. And so we really took it back to small, what we were calling quick hit tabletop exercises with different teams, individual teams, to talk through what their plans were, what this would look like in their department. We then grew that to a more traditional tabletop exercise, moving on to functional, which is really where we're at right now. Again, working with the individual teams, that's where we spent the first year. We're now to the point of putting multiple teams together to work through systems in that functional exercise level. But we're really with the plan of doing a full scale exercise leading up to the World Cup. But we're finding by taking that really back to the basics that we're able to do a lot of education with teams, and they're walking away with a lot more understanding of what they would need to do to respond. And that is what we saw the day of the Super Bowl parade. We also have worked closely with our what we call CMPFS, so Care Management and Patient and Family Services team. Think social work, language services, chaplain, that group, around patient reunification. We rewrote that plan in late 2023 and started drilling that. So we had actually had a full-scale drill of that shortly before the parade, which was beneficial because we ended up needing to use some of that during the parade response. As an organization, we have also been hearing a lot about safety concerns from our staff, even from some of our family. And so there was an executive decision made that we were going to spend 90 days, what we called a 90-day sprint, really focused on security and safety concerns. And so we conducted what we called a security threat assessment, or rapid improvement team, And that was focused on not only prevention, but response. And so emergency management, along with multidisciplinary teams throughout the organization, participated in that. One of the bigger takeaways for emergency management was the need for not only active shooter education, which we had been giving people through, modules and different kind of the normal education tools, but active shooter simulations. And so we have since partnered with an outside team that comes in and does those simulations with us. We do roughly 4 to 5 a year. We have since 2022, we are continuing those. And that is, we have simulated gunfire. There's actors that come in and are, loud and aggressive. And so we work with the teams within their spaces to say, what would this look like if this happened in your area and how would you respond? And lastly, probably one of the more impactful things that we saw that day is that we developed a pediatric medical specialty team that is part of the Missouri DMAT team. So when DMAT is deployed, they have the option of requesting our team to come, and we are there to provide that pediatric specific medical support, either for a deployment or a planned event. So moving on to Super Bowl parade and Victory Rally Day. These are some of the things that we did related to preparedness for the parade itself. We in Kansas City have been fortunate to have a World Series parade recently, along with, this is now our third Super Bowl parade. So a lot of this is lessons learned based on that. But 2 weeks prior to the Super Bowl, when we knew we were going to be going, that's when we started talking to our teams. The first thing we did was identify the leaders that would be involved day of. So either they were on call for their given position or they were going to be on site. And we partially activated our hospital incident command system and team. And so we met with those senior leaders to say, Super Bowl parade day, here's what we need from you. Here's what we need leading up to that day. And if something happens day of, you will be part of the HECC team that will respond and help us make decisions around whatever is happening at the time. We had multiple pre-parade briefings with those leaders. We made sure they were multidisciplinary, multi-department, to talk through operational decisions that we needed to make leading up to it, and then talk through some decisions that we may need to make day of, depending on what we encountered. Based on those briefings, we broke it up into 2 different ways to address it. And so we modified our operations for a mass gathering event. Again, this is something that we do now often when we have large events in downtown Kansas City, just because of the proximity of these events to our hospital. Things like that look like talking to leaders who have staff that could potentially work from home and encouraging them to do so, just to keep some of the congestion away from the hospital and keep the roads open. We look at our inpatient or our in-person ambulatory visits that are at our downtown campus and say, can those go to telehealth? Can they move to another location that we have in the metro area? We give the families the option to reschedule if they want to stay out of downtown. Again, really to just kind of help alleviate some of that congestion. We also look at our surgeries. We do have surgery capabilities at our Kansas campus. And so we look at, are there elective surgeries that we can move to that location to keep some of our space open here, but also, to help the families, just it's easier to get in and out there. So we do look at that. We work with our supply chain, our blood bank, to make sure that we're getting deliveries in early if we need to, that we're increasing quantities of critical supplies, kind of the usual things that you would think of related to some of your supply chain things that we would typically see. The other thing we do, because we know mass gatherings come with cascading hazards, one of which is a possible MCI, is we talked through modified operations with that as well. So for us, even though we had moved some of our elective surgeries to a different campus, some of the families, had opted to cancel their surgery that day just because they didn't want to come downtown and deal with the crowds. We made sure that our ORs were still fully staffed. We had all of our subspecialists here and ready to go. So even though the caseload was reduced, we still had all of those surgeons and the surgical staff available. Our emergency management team staged in our hospital incident command center so that we were able to have that ready to go if we needed to fully activate. And then we were also plugged in and communicating with the city and state around what was going on there. And then from an ED perspective, we talked through MCI with them leading up, but we also had staged our decon hazmat equipment so that in the event of something happening, that was already ready to go. And then, as always, just proactively trying to communicate. We did that both internally and externally. We had messaging to our staff. We had talking points for leaders ready to go. We used social media and the patient portal to, communicate that there was anticipation of road closures and traffic, and certainly if their appointments were going to get moved around. We did that, especially internally with staff too, to say, if we win, here's what you can expect. Here are the things that we're planning. And so once we did win and we knew that we were going to modify some of those operations, that was not the first time they were hearing that. So looking at our on-scene medical preparedness, just to give you guys a little bit of an orientation of where this all is. So you're looking at a bird's eye view of downtown Kansas City. That large blue circle, that's the outline right there kind of in the middle, is where the parade ended and the victory rally took place. So that's right in front of Union Station. And that's really where the bulk of all of our, the crowd was. On the right-hand side, you can see a large blue dot and a green dot. That blue dot is Children's Mercy, our Adele Hall campus. Again, we're a level 1 pediatric trauma center. Right next to us is University Health, which is a level 1 adult trauma center. That's about half a mile from where the stage was, is where we're at. For the medical, on-scene medical, the 2 orange dots are the 2 main tents from DMAT, which Troy kind of briefly mentioned. So the west tent had 12 beds and the east tent had 8 beds. Both with the capacity or the capabilities to scale up if needed. That east tent over towards the right, you can see a blue line kind of going straight up from that straight north. That was the tent that was identified as the critical kind of care tent, because that's where the majority of the ambulances were staged. And you can see that line going up. That was going to be the route out to get those patients to the hospital. Really, all of those other roads were very congested with, either being blocked or just people. And so that was really the plan there. And the plan was, if there were criticals in the west tent, they would be moved over to that east tent, which will come into play kind of later as we talk. The yellow dot that you see kind of at the top, that is actually inside Union Station. That's the VIP area. So that's where the players and the families were treated. Some of our VIP community members. So that's where they were. And then the purple dot kind of down at the bottom is where there was kind of first aid station set up. Again, like Troy mentioned, we had gators, UTVs, different things roaming around to bring patients to kind of the appropriate place for that. The other thing from a medical perspective, you can see who was there. So Kjelsey Fire Department is one of the kind of the main people that helped coordinate this. Missouri DMAT was there. They had asked for our Children's Mercy pediatric team to assist them. So we did have a team down there as well. University Health, again, that's that level 1 trauma center right next to us, had a team down there, as did the University of Kansas Medical Center. But to Troy's kind of point when he was sharing, we had medical teams throughout the community on scene to help with that the day of and helping to take care of anything that was going to happen down there. I will say the morning of, that DMAT team and the pediatric team, along with the fire department, did do a large briefing with the staff. Part of that actually did include discussions around what would happen in an active shooter event. What would it look like? What were the identified safe areas? What are some of the shelters that they could look at if they were away from the tents? They made sure that everyone had stop the bleed kits on hand. They knew where they were. If they were leaving the tent, they had made recommendations to take those stop the bleed kits. And so it just was fate, I guess, that they had just talked about that the morning of. So when you look at our pediatric medical specialty team in particular, so we staff that with an emergency medicine attending. We actually had an emergency medicine fellow down there as well. We utilize our critical care transport nurses as well as our ED nurses as well. So we had 5 people down there the day of. For the most part, we use the Missouri DMAT supplies, although we do bring some of those critical pediatric supplies that we need. So our trauma packs, our airway stuff, some of the critical care equipment. We do bring more pediatric specific meds. So some of your liquid Tylenol and ibuprofen, let gel, some other different things that we use in pediatrics. And I would say probably one of the things we use most when we go out with this team is our comfort kits. So change of clothes for kids that get sick, snacks, Pedialyte, stickers, things to keep them entertained while we're trying to give them care. So we bring those with us anytime we go out as well. So moving on to the response part of this. So the actual active shooter and then the MCI for us at Children's Mercy. So like Troy said, at the end of the rally, shots were fired from the west side of Union Station. Again, that is opposite of where that critical care tent was set up on the east side. Notification was sent out via web EOC within minutes, although we were all witnessing it on TV. So, it was really real-time notification. At that point, we were getting a lot of conflicting reports about how many shooters there were, how many victims there were, and what was going on. We do know now, and at the end of the day, that there were 23 people involved, half of which were children. One adult did die of her injuries in the field, unfortunately. So just a high level, and I'm not going to go through all of this, timeline of events for us here at Children's. So 1348 is when we were first notified of this shooting incident that took place. At that point, we were told there was 3 victims and 2 suspects. We immediately decided to, because of our proximity, lock down our campus and activate that full HECC team that we had been meeting with the days or the weeks prior. You can see really quickly within 10, 12 minutes, we were getting reports that there were now 9 known victims, 2 were critical. At that point, we were hearing that those shooters had moved inside of Union Station. Again, that's where our VIP area was set up, but more importantly, that was one of the identified safe shelter locations. So that was incredibly concerning when we heard that that was going on. We quickly got out mass communication to our staff about an active shooter, making it clear that it was at Union Station, not internal, but we did want to make sure that everyone saw that notification and knew that we were also aware of that and were acting on it. Something a little bit different for us than I think we had typically taught our staff is that we actually did not get our first patient for 20 minutes. And that was really due to the PMST, our pediatric team in the field, and the way that they were triaging. When we did get them, though, we got 4 trauma patients all at the same time. Kind of walking through that, you can see the timeline of when KCFD finally released a post that the active shooter threat was neutralized. That was over an hour. So a lot of confusion and kind of chaos during that hour to know what was going on down there. If the campus was safe, were we expecting more patients and whatnot. It was another hour after that before we knew the MCI was all clear and that all of those patients had been transported to a hospital. We made the decision internally not to deactivate or demobilize our HECC team until our team from the field was back at the hospital. Our operations internally were stabilized sooner than that, but we really felt it was important to get those eyes on those people and get those people checked in on before we kind of stood down. So this is looking at the on-scene medical response. This is, again, only related to the shooting itself. They saw many more patients through the day with kind of a range of medical things, but what the shooting itself was 22 patients. Again, there was that 23rd who unfortunately died in the field. 18 of those were gunshot wounds and 4 of those were incidentals. You can see from the graphs there kind of the age range of the kids, or I'm sorry, of the victims, along with the hospitals that they ended up in. I know a lot of us have been kind of taught that, 25 to 30% of your MCI victims will be pediatrics, but this was a situation where there was many more pediatrics involved. And I think it's just because of the event that was taking place and really where the shooting was within the crowd. So this is what it looked like at Children's Mercy for us. We got 13 total patients at our Adele Hall campus. We were extremely fortunate that our patients were not critical. The really, really critical ones were the adult patients that were over at University Health. That said, 2 of ours did require surgery for lower extremity gunshot wounds. The team that was in the field did make the decision to keep one family together. So one of the moms of the patients who had also sustained a GSW but was stable was sent to us, and we treated her as well. Our kids ranged in age from 5 to 16. Again, a little bit different than we typically hear in an MCI. The bulk of them arrived via EMS. Only 2 of them arrived via private vehicle, and that was really just because of crowd congestion, road closures. Vehicles really weren't down there, and so the bulk of them arrived via EMS. We did end up admitting 3 patients total. 2 of those were the ones that went to surgery. Another one just needed to be obsed for a little bit, and they were all released in a matter of days. So super fortunate. When we did do a full activation of our HECC team, talking through a little bit what that looked like. Again, we had those identified leaders and staff members come down to the command center immediately. You can see our command center there in the picture. We were able to pull up KC Scout to see what's going on the roads, our helipad, the news. We were plugged in with through WebEOC and EICS to talk to the city and get real-time updates and kind of share back with them what we were experiencing. Our incident commander that day was our chief nursing officer. We found out at the end of it, once we demobilized, she shared with us that her daughter was actually down on the scene and she had not been able to locate her. I will tell you from being there, you would have never known that the way that she handled this incident. But just kind of a reminder to everyone that even though your staff that is helping lead, the incident, just a reminder that they also may be impacted by this or have people that are impacted by this. Again, we immediately sent out that mass notification to all staff of an active shooter. Further communication was sent out via email, which, there have been taught, and we put in that communication, that all other communication will be sent out via email. Please watch that. However, we would send out mass notification again via Everbridge is what we use, had the situation changed or there been a new concern that we felt like needed to be paged out. I kind of already mentioned who we were coordinating with between the hospital and our external parties. We also had security coordinating with KC PD, not policy, for the continued security needs. This was something that I think we would not have anticipated. The way that we had to lock down is a little bit different than what we would typically do, just because for that hour the scene wasn't secure, and PD was really asking us to help with crowd control and keeping everyone outside so that they could kind of find those shooters and secure the scene. So something that we'll be working on or we're still working on, I guess I would say. We did set up a discharge lounge so that the families that were discharged during that time or patients that were waiting to leave could make the decision. We encouraged them to stay in the hospital until we knew it was safe. Some of them chose to leave, but the bulk decided to stay. And so setting up that discharge lounge where we could have snacks, games, just things for the kids to keep them busy and also provide support to the family was important. We did activate our family reunification plan. We set up a call line for family members. I would say we probably got calls coming in before our patients even arrived. So there was a real need for that kind of moment one. And then, the media was calling first thing as well. And so coordinating media briefings and getting that all set up was something that we were doing. That was conducted by our incident commander again, our chief nursing officer. So communication, we kind of talked about the mass notification that we sent out to staff. We did do continued updates via email. We do also have internally the option to set up kind of a banner display on our internal internet so that we can kind of have forward-facing updates, so that especially those clinical teams maybe that aren't always able to get into their email can see the latest communication from us. And then we used a lot of social media and the portal to communicate with our families. So that was really day of, or I guess I should say response. Before we demobilized HECC, though, we immediately started talking about recovery, although a lot of those recovery efforts didn't start until the next day. But we really broke it down into short-term recovery and long-term recovery. And so short-term for us, we immediately got resources up and out to the community, both in English and Spanish, to say, how do you help kids in a situation like that? What are the signs to look for? What are some behaviors that would maybe be concerning that you'd want to seek help for? We put those up first thing the next morning. But night of, we sent our Center for Wellbeing support staff down to the parade site so that we could provide support for that team that was directly involved in that. We also sent staff to the ED and the OR, some wellbeing staff to provide support to those teams. We did the next day also start tiered debriefs with our response teams, really to check in with them, most importantly, but then also talk about things that went well, things that we could improve for next time. And then just remind them that we're here and that we're going to set up services for the longer term, so that they knew that this was not something that we were just going to talk about once and be done with. So long-term recovery efforts for us, this is really based on community and providing services to kids. But I will say our Center for Wellbeing had things set up for almost a month afterwards. So open time where you could come in and get one-to-one counseling. There were group sessions. There was help to get connected with a community therapist if that's what was needed. We've done a lot of work internally for the teams, and so had that support set up through that month. There are still things that we're doing for people that are still impacted. We have seen kind of a spike in some of the stress and anxiety around it once football season started back up again. And now that, the team is doing well around, do we want another Super Bowl parade here? A lot of people don't. And so we're really trying to provide that ongoing support for them. But from a community perspective and from a pediatric perspective, we started within that first week using SciStart, which is a triage tool related to mental health and behavioral health concerns that really helps you quickly identify the level of resources or care that a patient needs. We were already planning on using those in our EDs. This expedited those, but so we started using those with our social work teams. We also introduced those to our community providers to say, here is something that you can use if you're interested, that may help you determine who maybe needs to go to an ED for assistance versus who can be seen in the community. We felt really strongly about having a community approach to this. And so we set up with 5 other organizations, a panel, which we were calling a community collaboration session. And so we invited in providers, schools, daycares, really anyone that interacted with children on a day-to-day basis. They certainly didn't need to be healthcare providers, to say, what do you guys need? What are you hearing? Here's what we can offer. Here's the services that we know about in the community, and really formed a partnership with them. We still have regular check-ins with that same group to say, how are things going? What are you guys hearing now? What are we seeing? We know in pediatrics, it's often 3 to 6 months before you really start seeing the impact of these incidents. And so we wanted to get resources out to them and training out to them if possible, kind of in that 3 to 6 month window. We were fortunate because of some of our grant money and philanthropy dollars that we got from our community, that we were able to offer multiple trainings to those in the community who work closely with children. Again, not just medical providers, but anyone really that interacts with them. So you can see all the trainings we were able to offer there. Those were free of charge. I think we've had 300 different groups and or people come through and participate in those trainings. We are still doing the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy training. That'll be ongoing for the next 6 months. And now we're working at this point with our healthcare coalition to talk through sustainment of this and kind of what this would look like long-term. Some of the key takeaways for us, and I will say that there are many more than this, just trying to kind of highlight some of the top ones for you guys, but having that pediatric medical specialty team was vital in the field, not only in order to make sure that the kids were getting the care they need, but we often see that kids make people nervous, right? And so they really want to send the kids away first, get them to the care place that they need, but the adults were really more critical. And so while we had people in the field trying to send the pediatrics first, our team was able to hold those kids back and say, these adults really need to go first. They are much more critical. We'll manage the kids here. Hence that 20-minute delay. But the DMAT and the PMST team, I think the city finally had made a statement that they were credited with saving 8 lives of critical patients because of the way that they managed and triaged that. So kudos to all the teams in the field for that. Also, planning and preparation prior to the event was critical. Again, we took steps leading up to the parade, but it was really those years of work behind the scenes that helped us with our ability to respond. I know Troy hit on patient tracking. It sounds like it went fairly well in the field. I will tell you internally, it was incredibly difficult for us to keep track of who was a disaster, who was related to the MCI, what patients were we going to say was related to the parade. We had patients coming in kind of all day long from there, but who are we really going to say is related to this? Something that wasn't well known is that there was a shooting about a block away, probably 20 minutes before this larger shooting took place. And so we had actually gotten a kid in from that shooting. And so trying to figure out who was with what shooting, what numbers were we going to kind of report, where all the kids were was a lot harder than I think we anticipated, especially considering, really we only got 13 patients. So we're doing a lot to focus on that right now. And then, Troy hit on it too. Can't be stressed enough that continued mental health support is just necessary, not only for the community, but for your internal staff and teams. And it's really necessary to focus on when you're looking at recovering from something like this. So that is what I have to share with you guys. I know we were going to open it up to questions at this point. Again, appreciate you guys letting us come and share our experiences with this day of.
Yeah, this is Vicki. Thanks so much, Troy and Morgan. That was really great. We do have some questions for us to talk about. First question, what did not go well? What would you change about that day?
For us, I think we did not end up activating our MCI. We did not page one out. We did not activate that. And that was really because we had a team in the field who was giving us real-time numbers of how many patients we could expect. They were communicating directly with the ED. And so we knew we had the resources to care for those kids without really having to call in a lot of extra staff. I will say, though, we heard afterwards with our debriefs that even though the ED and the OR were in a position to manage that, some of our, social work teams or some of the other teams could have benefited from us sending and activating an MCI because they needed to pull in resources. And so that was a big lesson learned for us. I think we also had, although our messaging went out quickly, which was a win for us, sharing that there was an active shooter, although it was externally, also caused a lot of panic and chaos. We had people sheltering in place and doing some different things that probably weren't necessary because the shooter was external. And so I think making sure our message is very, very clear. I think we probably could have done that a little bit better.
Mm.
And I think from the field standpoint, patient distribution could have went a little more smoothly. We saw a lot of adult patients went to University Health when we had St. Luke's, which also level 1. They only received 2 patients, so maybe more evenly distributing patients could have been improved upon.
I like that. What seemed like it would work in a drill, but didn't work as you expected in real life?
Just from the field standpoint, being 30 yards from gunfire and seeing that any training that we would have had or any training exercises that we've gone through on triage, it all is effectuated by the response, the fear that you have for yourself, the fear that you have for your team, and just the unknown of, is this still a hot scene? Is it safe? What are we rushing into? So I think nobody can really mentally prepare themselves for going through that and being that close to a traumatic incident, and then being able just to rush in and respond in such an effective manner. But I think that also that really captures the importance of training, because our team had just gone through the TECC training about a month before that, and your training is always what you revert to. So if you don't have good training, if you don't have good exercise of that training, then you're not going to be able to revert to it in this type of a crisis. So I don't know that anybody can really mentally prepare themselves for this, and that's probably not something that we could adequately respond to with the training. But making your training realistic, making your training exercises probable, and make it so that you're actually training the way you fight.
Yeah, I think for us, related to really reunification and just the surge of people that were walking up to the hospital for safe shelter, we're part of that kind of community safety net. And so we've always kind of had a plan for letting the people in, and here's where we would put them, and here's who would do what. That did not work at all when, local police departments asked us to kind of hold our doors closed, obviously let our patients in, but as best we could kind of manage the crowd outside. And that way there wasn't as much of a risk of, a shooter getting in the building and them not being able to find them. And so although we had just exercised our reunification plan and where social work was going to meet people and how security was going to work, that really threw a wrench in it that we hadn't anticipated. Honestly, I don't know that we would do it that way again. I think we might work a little bit differently with law enforcement on that. But I think in the moment, when you're just trying to figure out what the best way to do it and take direction from everybody. So it ended up working out fine, but I think that was something that was not anticipated, and we wouldn't have known to drill. Yeah.
Interest in triage. So first of all, what caused you, Troy, to use Jumpstart triage instead of SALT or some other triage system?
I think it's very situationally, not situationally, but jurisdictionally dependent. So it's not necessarily saying one's better over the other. I think that's just what a lot of us were more familiar with, and that's what was utilized. Every jurisdiction, every department's going to have a different type of preference, but I think it's really important just to have one identified. And when you're doing that, you're making sure that all of your people are operating off of that same method.
Sure, absolutely. How many reds versus yellows versus greens did you have in your patient population?
Morgan, are you able to break that down a little bit better?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. We had 9 reds, and then I think a couple of, yellows and maybe a green.
Okay.
And as Morgan mentioned, that pediatric team that we had embedded with DMAT really, kids are scary, right? Like they're scary to triage. They're scary when we're looking at traumatic injuries occurring to these children that should not be occurring to them. And so our triage might have been a higher acuity in the field. And then once we got them to the casualty collection point where the pediatric team could do a much better reassessment and a more focused triage, maybe a red went to a yellow. So we didn't necessarily need to, as Morgan said, take those pediatric patients of lower acuity out prior to a higher acuity adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pediatric patients tend to be reds, don't they? Just because we want to make sure that they get taken care of. Triage question: the secondary triage area, what were what treatments that you allowed there, and how did you decide what would be allowed versus immediate transport?
Morgan can probably touch base on kind of what the pediatric team did in the tents, but the secondary triage was really limited into more of a we did the initial triage in the field using the respirations, perfusion, or mental status, getting them to the tent. That secondary triage was more so a more detailed physical exam. Did we have any areas of injury which we didn't identify in our primary triage? And then, as mentioned, we're still in a potentially active threat situation. So getting all of those patients back, we didn't do a whole lot of further treatment in the secondary triage area. Several received IVs, just saline locked IVs, cervical collars if applicable, additional bleeding control, but really not a lot of advanced procedures. I know there were several advanced procedures performed that day, including needle decompression. There was a trauma code that was worked and some of those things, but we really did not do a whole lot of ALS level care. Now those tents and those casualty collection points were able to, because that was the whole focus of DMAT that day, is to take the surge and the need for patients to be transported to a hospital that really didn't necessarily need to be going to an ER. So we had a high capacity and high capability within the DMAT area to include labs, x-ray, meds, and things of that nature. But when the MCI incident occurred and we enacted those protocols, we limited our treatment to just basic care, some ALS care, primarily IV or some sort of medication access.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, probably pretty similar for our team. I think the one other thing that they were kind of working through and triaging is what parents were with child and were they stable enough to come to children's, just to keep them together. So that was kind of a social type triage they were doing as well.
Mm-hmm. Joni asks, I believe you said you had 2 casualty collection points. Did that seem to be enough?
As Morgan said, the DMAT East was going to be our critical care tent to start with, and that had a direct route going north there on the roadway to get patients out. Just due to the proximity of the incident to the DMAT West tent, that kind of became our default triage and treatment area. And then we were able to get ambulances routed down that way. I don't know if the 2 casualty collection points were enough. Morgan alluded to how many beds we had, but the importance of it is we had pre-identified casualty collection points. So we weren't taking them, to area A, area B, area C, and then area D is somewhere that we didn't know patients were, and we've got patients piling up there. So the importance is, in any planning, pre-identify those, whether it be just a small small town event, a parade in your local community, a concert in your local community, identify where those casualty collection points were. And when you're looking at them, look at egress and ingress for your patient transport capabilities. So are the ambulances able to get in and out fairly easily? Are you able to move patients from the casualty collection points? But I think the two DMAT tents, and then Morgan mentioned Kjelsey Medical had more of a first aid tent set up towards the war memorial. So I think between those three, we were able to fairly effectively handle all of the daily medical needs that were occurring throughout the event.
Yeah, and a lot of the critical care supplies that were in the East tent were packaged in a way that they were mobile. So when everything kind of happened at the West tent, a lot of the team that was stationed was able to grab their packs and go over to the West tent and kind of move operations over. So because of the way it was set up and the way that they were able to kind of scale and move people, I think we did have kind of plenty of space for this incident. If you get too many tents going, then you obviously need a lot more people and staff down there, and it's a lot more logistics to kind of figure out. So I do think it worked. It ended up working well.
Do your field staff wear bulletproof gear?
So several of the EMS departments that were there had ballistic shields issued to them. Several of them had them with them that day. My team at that time did not. We're currently working on that, but that is one thing that was discussed in after action reports with Kansas City Fire, that if you have a response agency that has ballistic ability, PPE to bring that. And that's one thing we would probably change in future MCI protocols is if you have that capability, ensuring that you have that with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know medical didn't within the tents. Part of the plan and what happened was basically once that all started occurring, PD kind of formed a wall around both medical tents as kind of a shield. So when you talk to our providers and staff that were down there, they, as much as you could, felt fairly safe within those tents because of that.
Wow. I like that. Did you have issues with self-dispatching or bystanders rendering medical care that was problematic for you?
I think in this situation or any situation, most people want to help one another, right? So I think that goes back to that building the resilience in our community, ensuring that they have a proper response. So ensuring that people have adequate knowledge in bleeding control, basic airway control, some of those simplest things that they can do prior to the professionals arriving that increase the chance of survivability. So I don't know that it hindered us. There was just a lot of pedestrian traffic. There were still a lot of people that were still confused trying to evacuate the area. So being able to get to the patients sometimes was difficult just because of the mass confusion, the mass amount of people that were there. But other than that, I don't know that we saw a whole lot of issues with the rendering of care. I think a lot of the people that rendered care were doing it in a manner that was what they felt best was for the patient.
It was shared with us here by multiple community members that the kids were actually doing a lot of helping the adults with run, hide, fight because they learn it in school. And so they were taking a lot of the adults and saying, follow me, here's where we should go, which is amazing and heartbreaking all at the same time.
Yeah. Cool and sad.
Both.
Yeah. So at the hospital, can you talk a little more about your reunification process and how you ensure that kids get with the right custodial parent? Yeah,
so we have a pretty complex reunification process. So there's multiple kind of ways that we've got kind of an intake form, whether that's started in the ED by a social worker from, adults arriving, if by phone, but we all kind of work off the same form. it's anything from, name, date of birth, kind of the usual stuff, but then identifying characteristics, what they were wearing, kind of anything that would help us with reunification. So kids that don't need medical care, we have an identified patient safe area that they go to that's then staffed by child life, social work. We've got our reunification area that's kind of outside of that. So when we make a match, we can escort the kid over to that area and reunify them. We do have a different system with like different color armbands for reunification parents or patients and parents, so that it's a signal to security or anyone walking in the hall that, these two do belong together. It's pretty complex. I'm certainly happy to share that plan with anybody, but some of it is the stuff that we use kind of every day in the ED when we get a trauma or DOE patient that shows up, and what we do to reunify those. And then other measures that we put in place just for safety on that large of a scale.
Yeah, we do have a specific request for more information on how to do reunification. That would be great. If you've got something you can share, we'd be happy to share it with people.
Yep.
How did you deal with the media?
Media was calling quickly. We're fortunate that we have a really great comms and marketing team. We have an identified PIO who's done a lot of training with us. And so we were able to kind of quickly get out a basic statement to them that said, yes, we've received, patients. We will get back to you, at this time with more information. Quickly started setting up more of a press conference type of scenario so that we could kind of tell them, hey, if you come here at this time, like, we'll be ready to talk. We have a media line that really, is used every day, but we put a reminder out to staff throughout the organization to say, remember, we don't share anything with the media, send them to this line that's staffed by our media team. So it was incredibly stressful because that was happening while we were still getting patients. And, for a lot of us, didn't feel like the priority, but, we know that it is a priority at the same time. So I do think we had some lessons learned around the media, and we've already worked through some kind of scripting that we can put out more quickly just to kind of keep those calls at bay, to give us a little bit more time. The other thing we've done is partner with local law enforcement's PIO to say, how can we work together? They've got kind of a standard to get messaging out within a certain amount of time, which is probably more quick than we're going to get something. And so partnering with them to say, are we allowed to kind of take from yours, and, here's what you can expect from us, and what we're going to share versus not, and all that kind of stuff. So.
And I think to kind of piggyback off what Morgan said, it's important to collaborate with all the PIOs, especially in a situation such as this where you have that criminal component. We don't want to be putting any information out there that could risk any part of the investigation or the ultimate prosecution. So when you have that criminal component, I think that adds a whole nother layer that you have to be especially careful when you're sharing any information out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How did you talked about mental health needs for the community, but can you go into a little more detail about how you are caring for the mental health of your responders?
So one thing we did for just my small team that was deployed, we had a debrief the day following and have continued to do that. We've worked through our peer support at the county level, as well as the Kansas EMS Association's Peer Support Society. But I think as a whole, KCFD held several debriefing opportunities to check on staff, but it has to come back to, as Morgan said, that showing that support, so them not demobilizing their HECC structure until their team was back, to just that continuous well-being check-in and asking how the staff's doing, and then not doing it in an actively listening manner, not just saying, okay, I'm checking on you, but if you have an issue, I'm going to ignore it, actively addressing any types of struggles that they're facing. So constant check-ins, working with professionals, whether it be your local peer support if you have that available, any state associations, and then since this kind of spans over a multi-state area, the 1033 Foundation is a great opportunity for multiple states to be involved in, because it spans such a area over the Midwest. And if anybody's in need of the 1033 Foundation, I'd be happy to get you in contact with our local leader for the Midwest area, but they're a great resource as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the same thing. I mean, I think the early kind of touch point of checking in, I mean, we did those hot washes and debrief day of, like right after, stood up services internally, but also, shared that we have resources that are available if staff are looking for them externally as well. We do still do wellness rounds with the teams and individuals that we know that have, either reached out and asked for that, or that we know have been impacted. We heard a lot about from our staff, like, I'll be okay as long as my kids are okay. And so, making sure that we're not only helping them, but making sure that their kids are also going to get the resources that they need. We also put out, just kind of talking points or things for leaders. Some of your staff may want to go home, and, let's work together to make that happen for them. Other staff aren't going to want to go home, so please don't force your staff to do that. Just giving them some kind of direction, but also autonomy to say, we're going to support you with whatever you're deciding that you need to do that's best for either your whole team or an individual team member. I know University Health was able to use some money that was donated by the community to pay for some therapy services for their staff. That's something that they did, which I know is really appreciated by them. So there's definitely not a one size fits all, but I think it's showing up kind of moment one and continuing to show up and kind of adjust based on what you're hearing people tell you and what it is that they need.
Question, knowing what you know now, what would you change, or how are you altering your MCI protocols for future events?
I think one thing that I took away from this event was we were having just typical everyday patient contacts, right? And so one thing that I think would be helpful is to triage tag those patients. One, it's getting us into that muscle memory of how to do triage and how to use those triage tags. But also if an incident should occur, so if we're dealing with just the rally and the parade, but then the shooting occurred, we've already triaged those patients, right? So we don't have to go back into our treatment area and say, as Morgan was saying, trying to decide who's related to the incident, who's not. So if we have everybody pre-triage tagged, we know their acuity already. We know that they've already been evaluated, and that either yes, they're a priority, or no, they're not a priority when the actual MCI occurs. And then having those tags kind of readily available. And then one other thing is just MCI equipment. So additional, as Morgan said, additional stop the bleed type of tools, whether it be tourniquets, pressure bandages, things of that nature, and then having those tags so you can start triaging as you go along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the work that we've put in around MCI, with the teams that we've worked with, I don't know that I think there's a major something that we would improve from that. I mean, of course, we have takeaways. I do think one of the things, though, that we learned was probably a miss on our part is we've spent a lot of time and doing a lot of drills and education with kind of that frontline staff that's going to be responding. And we've spent a whole lot of time with, our HECC command staff talking through stuff and educating them on their role. And I think there was probably a gap on our end of, those frontline leaders who might not be doing either one of those things, providing direct patient care or in the command center. And so I think some of the challenges we ran into that day with communication or just some of the siloed work that was going on is because we've missed spending time with some of those teams. And so we have since completely revamped our education and have some different things in place now that are really specific to those kind of groups of people. The other thing is we found out our reunification kind of call system is a little bit clunky. And so that's definitely something that we need to improve so that that can just be turned on and staffed a little more quickly. Those are of the things that we've built and drilled, probably two of the bigger things that I would say we learned and need to work on.
One last question, and I appreciate your honesty and all of that. It can only help the rest of us. One last question. How would you recommend EMS agencies and hospitals begin working together if they don't work together now on preparedness?
I think they have to look at this incident and incidents that are occurring throughout the United States and decide if they want to have a successful response or not, because you're not going to have a successful or an efficient response or a well-coordinated response if you don't have that collaboration between pre-hospital and hospital. And it has to come down to just deciding if there are differences, setting those aside and doing what's right for the community and doing what's right for our patients. And it comes down to that work that you have to have. You have to have the collaboration and the cooperation between the two. And if you don't, you won't have a successful response, and it could impact the survivability of your patients.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think we are trying to be more intentional too about inviting our local EMS, fire, PD to our internal drills. KCPD was here with us today talking through active shooter hostage situation that we had some things that we weren't quite sure how that would go. And so they came in and did a tabletop with us for a couple of hours. EMS and fire came to our helipad crash drill to say, what would we do if this happened? You know, what's hazmat look like at this point? We also, partnered with them in community events that they're doing. So if they're doing something around stop the bleed or, fire prevention or whatever they may doing, we always say, hey, if you need more people, we're happy to partner with you. And so it's really forming those relationships and starting that dialogue. And then when things happen, or as you're trying to build out your plans, or they're trying to build out their plans, or we're doing a citywide drill, we have some of those relationships formed. There's trust within that. If we need to ask them, hey, in the pediatric population, can we do this maybe a little bit different? I feel like those conversations happen. They're a lot easier to have. And I think there's a lot more teamwork there. And then vice versa, if they come to us and say, hey, this really isn't working for us, and here's why, we're willing to kind of partner with them as well. So.
I love that. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for your transparency. Thanks for sharing your time and what you've learned. That there isn't a service out there or a hospital out there who doesn't need to be ready for something like this. We're not all Kansas City, but clearly, as our experience in Iowa and every state shows, you don't have to be a large city to have issues like this. So we very much appreciate you guys making the time for us. That's all we have for tonight. Thanks again.